Hello guys and welcome. My name is Faraz and in this video we'll be talking about the MVC framework. So we have currently completed 4 tickets in our pivotal tracker, that is setting up GitHub, generating our application, installing RSpec and generating our very first model. So the very first question that comes to your mind is what is this model? And the next ticket that we'll be doing is generating the home controller. So what are these controller models and everything? So in modern web development, every application follows a pattern called as MVC. MVC stands for Model, View, and Controller. So this is a traditional MVC diagram. The user begins at this part, that is the browser part. Whenever you request any website, say facebook.com, so your browser resolves the facebook.com's IP and it hits to the Facebook's web server. The web server then looks into the routes of your remaining path, like for this video, it is currently hosted at betterexplained.com/wordpress content/upload/ all these things. So this is the domain name. Your browser resolves this domain name to a particular machine IP address. The next part is the routes that begins here, and this is handled by the domain's web server. So anything apart from .com goes into the web server, which then looks into its routes and dispatches you to the appropriate controller. Now, your request might be of creating a new blog post, or you might want to see an existing blog post. So based on the request path, the controller chooses one of its actions, and let's say you want to view a blog post, so you are choosing a show action, so the controller queries for the element that you have searched for into model. Now the model is connected to your MySQL server, wherein it queries for the appropriate details in any format that is to be rendered by your front-end framework. So if you are rendering something on Angular, you might want to have something in JSON data. So the model brings that data in a hash format, and the controller can be used to cast this data into a JSON format, or if you are using the traditional Rails architecture, it can store it in an instance variable, which can then be used to be processed onto a view. So this is the traditional MVC diagram. Now let's see what happens in Rails. In this diagram, we see that there is a browser. Let's say you have made a request to a website and you hit the web server. So based on the request path that you have generated, if you are requesting something static, like say the logo of a website, that is not bound to change. So why bother spinning up your application server and running some search queries whereas it can be stored in a static location and can be served from there. So in Rails, there is something called as a public directory. So now anything and everything that you want to be made available to the public, the general public, to be accessed without bothering your Rails framework is stored in the public directory. So any assets, any CSS, any JavaScript, whatever your application, when it is compiled and it is ready, will be stored in public directory. So if your request is for a public static image, so it is rendered from the public and the web server handles that. If you have requested something else, let's say you have requested for someone's blog, or you have requested to add someone as a friend, so these things require some computation power. This is where Rails comes in. So as soon as the web server realizes that this path does not belong to the public directory, the web server forwards this request to the Rails framework, wherein the Rails routing kicks in. The Rails routing is stored in a file called as routes.rb, which is stored in the config directory. So the routes.rb compares your request path and tries to find out the appropriate controller and an appropriate action in that controller. Let's say you have requested for a blog and you wanted to see the contents of a blog. So based on the routing entries, it might want to redirect you to a blogs controller to a show action. So the controller executes the show method, which might have something called as a model call to a blog. So it will have something like blog.find and the ID. So now next the control flow goes over from the controller to the model, wherein the model brings in the uses this ID and queries for it in the database and finds the appropriate matching record, and it casts itself into its own attributes and it sends it to the controller. Now the controller has this data. What it does with it? It needs to send it to the user, which is not going to understand the code. So what it does is it uses the view, and it uses the view in a format wherein it is doing essentially a fill in the blanks. So a template is generated, and in that template, all the dynamic parts are filled in from the data structure that the model has sent, and the view just populates it and sends it as a HTML back to the web server. Now this web server simply shows you this the process request, and that's how a Rails MVC framework works. I hope that was a bit easy to understand. If not, we'll be exploring it in our further lectures when we are actually building on Rails. I'll see you guys in the next video.